Okay, we are live, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to our walking book club. We're so excited that we have a hybrid walking book club. So the last couple have been virtual, and this one will be both virtual with a walk coming up in a few days. And we're really excited to have a special guest. Before we get to her, I'm just a few housekeeping matters. I just wanted to mention that this event and our Sunday walk is part of the South Coast Spring Arts Initiative, which is a 10-day festival, and dozens of local organizations kind of got together and are putting together arts and cultural events for these 10 days. And so I would urge you to go and look at the websites, southcoastspringarts.org. It's just been tremendous to see all these people working from Wareham to Westport. So take a look at that. We also want to thank our partners for tonight's event and for Sunday's walk, the Partners Village store, Buy Black New Bedford, the One South Coast Chamber, and the New Bedford Symphony Orchestra. So thanks to all of them. And I will first start by, my name is Marlissa Brigitte. I'm with South Coast Almanac. We're here with Corey Nuffer, who's also with us. And she's a writer and an editor and our walking book club maestro, I think is what I decided I'd call you tonight. Every time you have a different title. And we're thrilled to be here. And our special guest is Miss Aurelia Bundles, who is the author of On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker. It is the story of her great-great-grandmother who built a hair care empire. She is also the author. She's working on her fifth book, The Joy Goddess of Harlem, Aurelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, which is a biography of her great-grandmother, Aurelia, who was Madam Walker's daughter. The Self-Made, or On Her Own Ground, is the book that we chose for the Walking Book Club, in part because I saw you on a Zoom discussion somewhat like this. So we welcome everybody who hasn't read the book yet, because when I first listened to you, I hadn't read the book, and it prompted me to want to read the book, and it's really a great one. So we hope if you're joining us and you have read the book, great. And if you haven't, that's fine too. If you have any questions throughout the hour-long discussion, please feel free to put them up in the chat. I will keep an eye out. I can see them, and we'll try to intersperse those in. We do love questions, so throw them out there. I think that one thing is, if you don't have a YouTube account, it might be you won't be able to do a comment, and so I apologize for that. But hopefully you'll be able to. So let us start. Aurelia, welcome. Thank you so much.
I'm delighted to be here.
So Corey and I had been talking about how you wrote the book in 2000. It was published in 2001. Right. You probably had been working on it for many years before that. So for many, many, many years, you've had to introduce people to Madam Walker and give her kind of little short biography. And so we thought for tonight, rather than asking you to repeat what you always have to do, we might show a little clip of you doing it for the biography channel. Was it the biography.com?
Right, biography.com. Right.
And we thought that would be fun because it does show some images of Madam Walker. And we always think that having some context and having some images of who we're going to talk about is fun. So I'm going to add that up, and
I had fun doing that, so I'm glad that's going to be shown.
Let's see. Let me know if you can't hear it. I can, but I want to make sure you guys can.
Madam C.J. Walker was born Sarah Breedlove in 1867 on a plantation in Delta, Louisiana, where her parents had been slaves before the Civil War. And her early life was really bleak. By the time she was 7 years old, both parents had died. She got married at 14, she said, to get a home of her own because she was being abused by a cruel brother-in-law, as she described him. She became a mother at 17 and a widow at 20. Necessity is always the mother of invention, and Madam C.J. Walker was losing her hair. There was no big line of hair care products for Black women or white women at the time. People usually used home remedies. She eventually came up with her own formula. And the real secret was not the product itself, but it was washing her hair more often and applying an ointment that contained sulfur. And this was really pretty revolutionary at the time. You think about it, there was no penicillin, there was no aspirin. Skin care, scalp care was something that was really neglected. People didn't bathe very often. They washed their hair even less often, sometimes not at all during the winter. And as a result, a lot of people were going bald. They had really horrible scalp disease. Sarah Breedlove, who later became Madam C.J. Walker, was one of those women. And by developing this system, essentially, her scalp became healthy. Her hair began to grow back. She developed a hair care product line, and then she trained thousands of other women who began to buy and sell her products. And by the time she moved to Harlem in 1916, she was one of the wealthiest and most successful African-American entrepreneurs in the country.
Okay, let me take that. So there is, if you don't know who Madam Walker is, now you have a little bit of an insight. And my first question, and then I'll hand it over to Corey because I know she has a lot of great questions, but my first question is kind of what, I love that you're telling her story, you know, as her great-granddaughter, that you have that sort of honor and privilege. And so I guess what is it that you most want to share with people when you're trying to describe your great-great-grandmother?
Well, I mean, first I will just say it's so nice to be with you. And I love that you're doing this tour and I wish I could be there in person.
We wish you could too.
But I love the whole concept of what you've been doing with books and tours and highlighting history. That's just right up my alley. And I tell this story. I'll tell you what I want people to remember about Madam Walker. But, I grew up in a household where my mother was vice president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company. I was surrounded by things that had belonged to Madam Walker and Alelia Walker, though we didn't sit around the dinner table talking about them. And, women's history and the history of African Americans certainly was not in my textbooks. But I had a grandfather who was born in 1892 who knew this history and who had saved everything. And one of Madam Walker's secretaries, Violet Reynolds, who'd gone to work for her as a teenager in 1914, had saved everything. So I am really fortunate to have literally thousands of documents and photographs, et cetera, that have helped me tell the story. So when I finally got around to getting my mind around this is a great story to tell, now I had the material to tell it. And when I was growing up, there would be sometimes a paragraph about Madam Walker in books that included African Americans. There weren't a whole lot of books, but it was essentially the story. Madam Walker was born Sarah Breedlove on a plantation in Delta, Louisiana, December of 1867, on the same plantation where her parents and older siblings had been enslaved. First child in her family born free, orphaned at 7, married at 14 to escape a cruel brother-in-law to get a home of her own, mother at 17, widow at 20, moved up the river to St. Louis, where her older brothers had moved a decade earlier, where they were barbers. And she joined them. She joined the AME church. She was a washerwoman until she was 38 and a millionaire by the time she died at 51. So that was kind of the little paragraph that got told over and over again. But my research through many years and many trips and all of those things added to that to say, not only did she start a hair care company, but she was a pioneer of the beauty industry along with her contemporaries, Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein, though she was focused on Black women. And then she used her money to empower other women, to create jobs for them, to help them become economically independent, and use that money as a philanthropist and a political activist and a patron of the arts. So if there's anything that I want people to remember about her, it's that, yes, she was a pioneer of the hair care industry, but it was what she did with that fortune to empower women and to help them become economically independent that is the most important thing for me.
Cool.
Well, so very quickly, my feelers started to kind of freak out because you are a poet. There is unexpected beauty and reach toward this lush language that I kept encountering over and over again. Just a couple little, the gluey aroma of roast lamb. The apartment rambled down a long hushed hall, a spray of baby's breath, the syrupy mile-wide river. I mean, that not only makes for enjoyable reading, but it really is memorable. And so I was just like fascinated with your approach as a historian and as a writer who you want to enjoy yourself and put out a product that it's just it elevated things in a way that made me feel like there was more to it than that. So then I went on your website and I found a blog post you had put together after a poetry reading and panel discussion on Asian American literature today. And you quoted Ocean Vaughn, who's at UMass Amherst. I just had listened to something. He was on a podcast called On Being and was talking about, oh my gosh. So I was like, oh, and you had put in your blog post him saying that to create another world, one world is not enough. And then you quote R.A. Villanova in addressing a question concerning the relationship between poetry and politics. We write poems to bear witness. We're writing the poems that we need to write to build a bridge with others whose histories are as fraught as ours. You quoted him. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your own writing as a political act, especially in a time where we're finding that these important questions we need to have with each other, they often are anemic. You know, there's a binary there, and there should be oftentimes a lot of complexity. And I find that your lush, your storytelling, even if as Sarah moved around, I mean, you go on these great descriptions of the cities she's going to move into. I mean, I just was learning so much, even the history. I mean, it's so full and plump. So, I've given you.
Yeah, there's a lot. But I will say that. So a couple of the things that you mentioned there. So the idea of the poetic, is something, I think, as most young people, who want to be writers, in some ways you start out writing poetry, and then you get a job in journalism, and you have to not write poetry. But when I find myself in the best zone of writing, and I think that prologue, which where a couple of those lines that you quoted are from the prologue in the book. So that was sort of my very personal description of what I felt about writing. When I'm in the right zone, the prose that has all of this historical context does become poetry. In fact, I'm struggling right now with a chapter for the book that I'm writing, the biography I'm writing on Alelia Walker. I've written 27 or so chapters. This is actually chapter 3. And I came back to write it because I knew it was going to be emotionally complicated and complex. But I'm now at the point on, draft 12 where I'm starting to insert some poetry. It's starting to feel that way, but it takes me a long time to get, because when I do research, I research for, across the waterfront. I throw all the spaghetti on the wall, and then sometimes the sauce starts dripping down, and that's the part that's really good. But it takes me a long time. But when it's done, it's done. But the sort of wanting to share history with people, because I know that we don't learn history well. My history textbooks and my wonderful suburban, as I say, overwhelmingly white high school in Indianapolis. I got a great education. I had some really great teachers. Mentioned Black people as slaves, not enslaved people, as we say now, and said that slaves were contented and better off as slaves. So that was the way history was taught in the late 1960s. And I don't think it's that different in a lot of places now. But that's part of the reason I include so much history in my books, because I want to rewrite history. I want to write it the way it should have been written. And fortunately, I had this grandfather who cared a lot about history. So that are trying to write the poetry so that it's readable for people, and then to present history that hasn't been told, then gets to the politics. And the politics, we're right now seeing that we're in a moment where there's a lot of truth being told, and there's a lot of resistance to the truth being told. And we see the controversy over the 1619 Project with the New York Times, and then this attempt to do this 1776 commission, which wanted to just basically tell lies. And then there's Annette Gordon-Reed who's saying, it's both and. It's 1619 and 1776 and St. Augustine, so there's a lot we have to learn. And I think our history is very politicized because people want to control a narrative without necessarily telling the truth. So my politics comes out in my storytelling, but I really try to be really fact-based.
Absolutely. I looked up as much as I could, whether it was like in 1868, or the World's Fair in St. Louis. That was such a rabbit hole. I mean, you threw out a couple little things, but then I started looking it up and I couldn't believe, especially in relation to the other World's Fairs too. Or like the first Great Depression. I mean, you paint such a complicated picture that, because I kept thinking, okay, this is essential information. We're going to get back on to Sarah's story. So I need to know, silver was devalued in Germany. So what is that going to do with Sarah? And it was such, it was jaw-dropping how all of that seemed relevant. And once you got back onto Sarah's immediate story, I mean, I'm a changed person, but you are so right about that history not being told, and it feels so relevant, and it is transformative.
Well, because I'm trained as a journalist, so I'm a storyteller. But I have benefited a great deal from my friends who are historians. And so their work, their research, and biographers. And so I learn a great deal from them. But I also know I'm trying to put enough history in there so that people get some context. I appreciate you appreciating the history, because everybody does it. Some people think I've gone off onto a tangent. I think that's true for all writers who write history. You have to excise probably 10 out of the 15 pages in a chapter because you went off when you went down a rabbit hole, and you try to be judicious about the pieces of history that you include. So I think as I'm writing the book about A'Lelia Walker now, I'm probably not putting in quite as many details. I mean, you learn, you mature as a writer, you evolve as a writer. But I really wanted in that book to just kind of bring people in so they would understand the history. But let me say this about the World's Fair. Who knew the World's Fair was as much a propaganda narrative as anything else? It was ordering the world's peoples. And I went to the World's Fair. My family went to the World's Fair, I think in 1964 in New York, and it was the world of the future. And you had, food from all over the world, and it seemed pretty benign. But those original World's Fairs were really meant to create a hierarchy of civilizations.
Oh my gosh, even from physically standing on top, it was just jaw-dropping.
Right.
Melissa, do you want to ask the next question? I feel like I'm talking too much.
Oh, I have a couple of they're kind of quick and easy. I just wanted to point out, well, Buy Black New Bedford is this great organization that sort of arose after the in June during the protests. Josina Perry, who I hope is watching tonight, she's a physical therapist and just said, let me put together a list of Black-owned businesses. But I was just so taken by this woman who, as you like, orphaned at 7, that whole narrative, married at 14, a mother at 17, a widow at 20, a washerwoman till she's 38, like the sheer determination that it took. And I just wanted to say my favorite line. I'm hearing a little bit of feedback, so I'm going to mute you guys, but you can unmute yourself when you're going to speak because I can hear the feedback. But my favorite line, and having started this magazine, I guess it sort of spoke to me too. She said, when people asked her about starting a business, she said, I want you to know that whatever I have accomplished in life, I have paid for it by much thought and hard work. If there's an easy way, I haven't found it, she counseled. My advice to everyone expecting to go into business is to hit often and hit hard. In other words, strike with all your might. I love that quote, but I also was still like, how was she able to do it? I don't even like, how did that work? What do you think?
Listen, this is if I could have her here and say, come back for an hour and all the questions I would ask you. And it truly is that. So I've tried to pull the pieces together of what her early life was like. So I don't, there's nothing where she's quoted as saying, here's what my mother said to me. So I don't know that. Here's what my father said to me. What I do know is that she had these older brothers who had enough gumption to get themselves out of Madison Parish, Louisiana, but they were pushed in a sense by the racial violence that was going on, the political violence that was going on after the election of 1876. And her family minister had been elected a Black state senator during Reconstruction. So she had some, little inklings of people exercising their political power. And then once she got to St. Louis, I really truly think it was the women of the church who were her mentors. And her brothers had a barbershop, gave them a little bit more status than the average laborer. Their barbershop was very near St. Paul AME, and the African Methodist Episcopal Church had this long tradition of radicalism, really, of underground railroad stops, of educating Black people during slavery when it was illegal to read and write, of setting up missions around the world. So she in church every Sunday, she saw this example, this sort of international example, but also these women who were part of the club movement, Black women who were suffragists. So she was still a washerwoman, but she could see the power of women organized. And I think that those seeds were planted so that later, when she began to organize her agents and have her national conventions and create a sales force, she had that example in the back of her mind. But still, you had to be a pretty special person. And so it's genius. I mean, if she's Steve Jobs or Bill Gates.
More than that, because she had way more obstacles, and that was the other thing, is that she created this empire of all these sales agents. And one of the big things that struck me is that she basically was a B corporation, thinking about the social good before anybody had ever started thinking about that. So do you want to speak to that and sort of talk about that?
And I think that very much comes out of this sort of women's organizations, the National Association of Colored Women. That's a group that was founded in, I think, 1896, and in part in response to their interest in suffrage and sort of being pushed out of the white women's suffrage movement. They wanted to go to a convention. They weren't allowed to go. So they created their own organization. A lot of this is very much a New England initiative of these women some had gone to Oberlin. They were highly educated, and they wanted to be involved in the movement. So, yeah, I think that it is very much the Madam Walker seeing these other women, and then taking that example and taking it to the next level.
Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable. I loved it. And then I also loved sort of the progression of her activism growing as her company grew.
Right. Well, and that I love that too. I mean, I think if there's the surprising thing for me, because literally I had grown up with this story, this sort of that paragraph of, Madam Walker was a washerwoman, and then she started a business and became a millionaire, blah, blah, blah. But the surprising part for me was the activism. And as you said, the B Corporation, that she had gotten this example from seeing other women. They weren't just their motivation wasn't making money. Their motivation was changing their communities. Now, she realized that making money was important because it allowed women to become economically independent. That was, that was really important. But this using the funds and using the profits to make a difference in her community was really important to her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also just wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about it's kind of what we just talked about, but always knocking on doors. Like literally, that's what I loved about it. It was literally knocking on doors. And so one of the things she wanted to speak to Booker T. Washington, and she showed up on his porch. Can you just talk about that for people who haven't read the book? Because I just love that.
Well, and this is, Madeleine Albright has famously said sometimes women have to interrupt. And I think Madam Walker was very much in that tradition, that she was, she had seen the National Association of Colored Women, this national organization of Black women, meet in her church in 1904 during the World's Fair. And she wasn't a part of that group yet. She's still a washerwoman. She's still struggling. But she had seen Margaret Murray Washington, Booker T. Washington's wife. And Booker T. Washington was the most powerful Black man in America. He was more politically conservative than she, but still he was quite powerful. And she wanted his endorsement. And so she wrote letters to him, asked him to support her. She wasn't part of his inner circle. He kind of, pushed her aside, didn't acknowledge her, took time to answer. And then ultimately she made a big splash by making a philanthropic gift to the Indianapolis YMCA, the Black YMCA, $1,000, which was huge in 1911 when she did it. And the Black papers began to write about her. So everybody knew who she was at this point. She had done it out of the goodness of her heart, but it had made a huge difference. And so she asked Booker T. Washington if she could come to his convention in Tuskegee. And he wrote her this kind of condescending letter saying, well, yeah, I think you misunderstand the purpose of this convention. It's not really for you. And she shows up anyway with a letter of recommendation from a mutual friend and arrives on his doorstep. He still keeps her at arm's length, but she does get to speak. And then fast forward a year later, she wants to go to his convention, his National Negro Business League convention, which is the premier entrepreneurship gathering of African Americans at the time. So she arrives not on the program. And we all know when you have a conference, you have put the speakers in place, if not months in advance, certainly weeks in advance. But she arrives and says, hey, I'd like for you to just kind of find a slot for me. And and he's just reluctant. But so on the first day of the convention, there's a kind of a request to include her. And no, there's not room for her. On the second day of the convention, her good friend, George Knox, the publisher of the Black newspaper in Indianapolis, kind of a Black USA Today that's nationally distributed. He's a longtime compatriot of Washington's. He stands up and he says, we should hear from Madam Walker. She's the woman who gave $1,000 to the building fund in my hometown of Indianapolis. She has an incredible story to tell. And although they had a great deal of respect for each other, Knox and Washington says, no, we're discussing lifetime membership. And then he calls on one of Madam Walker's neighbors who's not discussing lifetime membership, who turns out to have been the treasurer of the fundraising campaign for the YMCA. And he had given $250 and Madam Walker had given $1,000. And there's some more details to that, but to make this long story short, I will just say that on the third day of the convention, As the last banker was completing his report, Madam Walker stood at her seat, looked toward Booker T. Washington at the podium, and said, "Surely you are not going to shut the door in my face. I am a woman who came from the cotton fields of the South. From there, I was promoted to the washtub. From there, I was promoted to the kitchen. And from there, I promoted myself into the business of manufacturing hair goods and preparations. And I have built my own factory on my own ground." The next year, he invited her back as a keynote speaker.
Yeah, you just want to just give her a big standing ovation at that point in the book.
Yes, and then I have that, because the world is really small. I mean, I'm fortunate that I know the descendants of a lot of her contemporaries. And I was one of the first times I was making those comments. One of Booker T. Washington's grandchildren happened to be in the audience. And so this was, kind of touchy for her. And I said, well, so what I always try to add to the story that when the dedication of the YMCA happened, Booker T. Washington came to Indianapolis. Madam Walker sent her chauffeur to the train station to pick him up. He was a guest in her home. And by the time he died in 1915, there was a mutual respect between the two. She still didn't agree with all of his politics, but she was able to navigate those politics.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Lelia, one thing I'm always fascinated about are all the organizations that older folks used to be members of and that younger people, like, they're not even around.
Right.
And I found that a couple moments where I kind of lit up, again, at the beginning of your book, when you mentioned the word blur in church, that she was so savvy. Like, she noticed that these, in the churches, in the pews, that folks of all economic, from privilege on down, blurred together.
Mm-hmm.
And you use the word blur several times, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's so important, the blur. And then you also were so good at naming a lot of these crazy sounding organizations, like the let's see here.
United Brothers of Friendship and the Sisters of the Mysterious.
Like, what? That's like two of just the craziest, like the Grand United Order of Odd Fellows.
Right.
Like, and then a lot of these organizations had women's auxiliaries of them too. And so, again, like, she was so mindful of bumping elbows with these people and getting to know who's who. I mean, so savvy. And then, especially once CJ came into the picture, like, they were such a well-oiled machine.
Mm-hmm.
But the newspapers, that's another thing. Like, newspapers were so important, and I just loved reading that and reading, understanding the attention she put in the advertising campaign she had, and the branding, and all of that. And the way you trot out this history, I felt like it was like, there's like, oh, maybe I can do something like that. Like, it felt like a blueprint. And it really impressed upon me, like, it is so important. If you don't have a church, like, what other organizations can you be involved in? And for a lot of young people, especially, there aren't any.
But there's so much that they have, the power to organize themselves on social media. I mean, they can go and on Zoom. I mean, all of the ways that they can actually organize themselves. But I do hope that the book can be a blueprint for some people as they're trying to tell their family stories. Because for me, the interest in the family story is what then made me interested in history. Because, as I say, in my high school history book, there was nothing that mentioned me in any way that felt relevant. It didn't talk about the members of my family who had been free people of color, or who had been in the Revolutionary War, or who had resisted slavery, or, so those people weren't talked about, but those people existed. And so I think when we know our stories and we know the historical context, we can, we begin to redefine who we are. And now there is so much. When I started doing my research, if I wanted to read the Chicago Defender, I would have to go to Chicago to the public library and go find the microfilm. You know, if I wanted to do something in Indiana, I'd have to go to Indiana. But now things are digital. The newspapers are digitized. You can go on newspapers.com or ProQuest or Genealogy Bank. The Madam Walker, 40,000 pages of the Madam Walker collection is digitized now at the Indiana Historical Society, just as W.B. Du Bois's papers are digitized at the University of Massachusetts. So there are ways to be able to pull, oh, and ancestry.com, let me not forget, I'm on there every day. But you can begin to tell these stories, and I think everybody's family has interesting narratives, and it's just a matter of organizing it and then throwing all that spaghetti up on the wall and then finding some poetry. That's the hard part.
Well, speaking of the stories, so now you're working on the second story, the sort of the sequel to Madam Walker, the story of her daughter. And I'm just curious if you can tell people a little bit about Alelia, I guess your her namesake. Right? And also, do you have a favorite now?
Well, you know, look, Alelia Walker was my favorite from the beginning. You know, she, and I think part of it is that we share a name. We almost share a birthday. Her birthday is June 6th. Mine is the 7th. And she was more, you know, flamboyant, and she knew the people that I was trying to discover when I was in high school in the 1960s, the Harlem Renaissance writers and artists that were fascinating. Madam Walker was more complicated because she was a businesswoman, because it was the, you know, sort of pulling apart the European beauty standards and African beauty standards and sort of trying to make sense of that and reconciling that. So, you know, I don't know. They both are sort of, they're so stand on their own. I love them both. You know, I guess I shouldn't pick a favorite. They're both really complicated. Alelia Walker is frustrating to me sometimes because I think she's rebelling against her mother, but she's just trying to, she's struggling to find her own voice. You know, they're really, I'm so fortunate to have this sort of mother-daughter relationship with Madam Walker, born at the end of the Civil War, dies right after World War I. Alelia Walker is born during Reconstruction, dies in the midst of the Depression. So I get this whole range of American history that I'm able to see through the lenses of these two women. I'm actually almost finished reading. There's a new book, Caitlin Greenidge's new book, Liberté. You know, check it out, look it up. But my book club is reading this book, and I'm doing audio books. I have about another 6 minutes to go. But it's very much about a complicated mother-daughter relationship, and that's what my story is.
So it's a lot of overlap with Madam Walker?
Yeah. So what I did, you know, in writing, when I was writing On Her Own Ground, when I started writing it, literally, you know, more than 20 years ago, I really thought I was writing a double biography. And I don't know, at some point, a quarter of the way, halfway through, I realized this needed to be Madam Walker's book and Alelia Walker needed a separate book. But what I did was I used their letters, which I use in both books, but On Her Own Ground is really Madam Walker's story with some of with her relationship with Alelia Walker woven in. The new book, The Joy Goddess of Harlem, is Alelia Walker's life, influenced by her mother. And so there's enough of her mother in there that you can see the interaction. But then there's a point where it becomes her life after her mother dies and all of the things that happened in Harlem during the 1920s. So one is through Madam Walker's eyes with some overlap. The other is through Alelia Walker's eyes with some overlap.
Mm-hmm. And when do you think you'll be done with that?
September, October. So
oh, that's and I don't know about you, Corey.
Wondering.
I'm so curious about chapter 3. I can't wait for it to be published so I can read chapter 3.
Chapter 3 is complicated because it's so my grandmother May May of the Long Braids was adopted by Alelia Walker, who was married 3 times but had no biological children. And so I wanted to talk about why that adoption happened, what the relationship was. And since writing On Her Own Ground, I have discovered that May's uncle lived in St. Louis, went to the same church as Madam and Alelia, and they knew each other before Madam moved to Indianapolis, and her grandmother lived across the alley from Madam Walker's factory. So there was a family connection that I didn't know anything about when I was writing the other book. So it's taken, sort of more decades of doing research. And so now I truly understand, and this actually is a bit of the Elizabeth Carter Brooks connection. Madam Walker knew her, visited her. And Elizabeth Carter Brooks adopted a young woman, and so did Margaret Murray Washington. So there are a number of women who were in this group who, adopting a young woman of promise was not an unusual act.
Mm-hmm. And so this is about your grandmother. Did you know your grandmother? Was she alive?
My grandmother died when my mother was a freshman at Howard.
Okay.
So I didn't know her, but I do have her letters, and my grandfather was still living. So I'm able to, piece together her life.
And what is it like to write about your family as a historian and journalist?
Well, I had this, sort of amazing moment with my mother when I was in graduate school at Columbia in journalism in the fall of 75, and I was starting to write this book. My advisor, Phil Garland, the only Black woman on the faculty, recognized my name, Alelia, and said, that's what you're going to write your paper about. And when I went back to Indianapolis for the Christmas holidays, my mom was in the hospital. She actually had lung cancer. She was terminal, and I didn't know it at the time because you don't know these things at 23. But one of our last conversations, I said, I'm starting to discover some things about Madam Walker that kind of don't fit the myth. And what do I do about that? And she said, tell the truth, baby. It's all right to tell the truth. And that gave me the permission to tell the story without trying to, gloss over things or whitewash it. And as a journalist, that's what I want to do. I want to tell, the truth. So I feel like I've tried. I wanted Madam Walker to have many dimensions and to show her flaws as well as her triumphs. So that's been the way that I've approached it.
Can I shout you out a little too? You were so good with handling what you speculated about. Because that can be dicey territory. I mean, you have lots of letters, there's lots of records, but there were still areas that you needed to go there and connect some dots. And there were numerous times where you would get so far into something and you would say, but this would call for some speculation. And then you would tell someone else's story that would then inform where you're going with the speculation. And it was lovely. I don't
thank you for noticing that. And I think there are times, now, so 20 years later, as I'm writing another book, as you get more savvy and, sophisticated about your writing. And so there's some things where I think, oh, maybe I was a little clunky at that. And can I smooth it out? But I did want to make sure that people understood when I didn't know for sure.
Yeah, I thought you did a great job.
Thanks.
And it was always interesting, like these little tendrils of history, whether it was like something about like some hyperbole you saw in the reportage back
yeah.
You would kind of like go there and trot out everything, or just finding another symmetrical story that someone else where there's records of their experience of something, and because of that then you were like, so it makes sense that this is probably why it happened or what happened or what have you.
Yeah, so, because once it's out there you kind of have to address it.
Yeah. Are you finding that there's a lot more I mean, there must be so much more with Alelia that wasn't with Madam Walker. Is it like night and day?
Well, there is a lot more because people have a lot more speculation about her. And people have written things that actually, it's like one person has written something and then the next 10 writers all repeat the same thing and it's inaccurate. So I'm kind of dealing with, how I address that. And then now and then with the movie, with Self-Made, which has entirely created total fictions about both of them, I'm having to deal with that as well.
We didn't even want to bring that up.
Right. Well, it's out there because people have seen it. I just want to say, it's a fictional work, and you just have to know that it's fiction. It's Hollywood.
So can you please be a part of the next series?
Yeah, and I was supposed to be more involved with Self-Made, but it just, the contracts and politics and all of that. But yeah, anything that goes forward, I will not be involved in unless I am fully involved. So, I'm already starting to work on some things. Thank goodness.
Care to maybe?
You mean for the next book? You're thinking
for the next book.
Oh, good. Yeah, I actually can't wait to read the next book. Like that's why I asked when will it be due, because I just want to read it
next year.
And then I don't want to put a lot of pressure, but beyond sort of that subject matter, do you have another book that you're going to start?
No. After this one is done, no more books.
Are you sure?
I'm totally positive.
And why is it? Because you just
because I want to have life.
Yeah. Alelia, do you have a team of people like help?
No, it's me.
So do you have like what situation do you have to kind of keep track of everything? This is a nerdy writing question.
No, I have a really detailed timeline and chronology. So there's from every article, letter, I take quotes. I have created this deep chronology. I have literally 2 rooms of my house are files. And this was some advice that I got from Alex Haley in the early 80s. Alex wanted very much to write Madam Walker, to do a mini series and to do a book on Madam Walker. I did the research for that, but in the process of putting together those files for him, he gave me this piece of advice, which has been extremely helpful. He said, make a file for every year of the person's life. So Madam Walker's born in 1867, died in 1919. So I did that. And Alelia Walker, born in 1885, died in 1931. I did that. But now those files literally have turned into 2 rooms of files. Wow. So it started out with, I drop a piece of information or an article in those files. Those have expanded. Then it became, with each newspaper, each newspaper has its own chronology with each individual. Literally probably 500 or 600 people who are their friends. There's a file on each one, because there's no way you can remember all of these things after decades of writing about somebody. So, now if I want to write about, say, one of their good friends, I know that there's a file. I just go pick up the file and then I can look at the information and find that little factoid that I need. So that's what keeps me organized.
Oh, so much work.
So I just wanted to share this comment from Lori Gomes. She says, I just want to say that I love what I'm hearing and so happy I tuned in. I was always inspired by her story and her philosophy. Thank you for sharing. And I just want to share that Lori has a business that is on our tour on Sunday. And I called around to the businesses and to tell them it's a Sunday, so most of them aren't open. But I just wanted to say, hey, we're going to have a group. And just so you know, don't be surprised. And I said, the book is Self-Made, about Madam C.J. Walker. And I would start to say who she was, like just a 1 sentence who she was. And Lori said, oh, I know who she is. Lori has a salon in downtown New Bedford. And so I love that. She was like, oh, I know who she is. And so Lori will be joining us on Sunday and we're thrilled. So thanks for listening tonight, Lori. We have like time for one more question, Corey, if you had one more, or we could I know one of the things we were going to ask is if Alelia wanted to read her a favorite passage from the book.
Okay. Do you want to do that?
Corey, do you have any? Oh, Corey, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
No, I've been waiting for this one.
Okay. All right, good. Yes, we'd love to hear.
So it's just 3 paragraphs, maybe 4. All right, this is from the prologue. In 1955, when my mother, my father, and I moved back to Indianapolis, I was 3 years old, and May, my grandmother, had been dead for nearly a decade. For a few weeks while we waited to move into our house, I slept in a room surrounded by my grandmother May's personal treasures in the apartment where my grandfather now lived. I remember that in the months afterwards, whenever Papa opened his front door to greet us, the gluey aroma of roast lamb, Lucky Strikes, and Old Man Musk coated my nostrils. In the entryway, as my mother knelt to adjust my hair bow and smooth my 3 long braids, my eyes always fixed upon a tall, moss green Chinese lacquered secretary. Letters, keys, stamps, and paper clips tumbled from its tiny gold-trimmed drawers and secret cubby holes. A serene maiden stood guard on the door of its locked upper cabinet. Even before I learned it had belonged to Madam and the first Alelia, I was tempted by its mysteries. Beyond the foyer, the apartment rambled down a long, hushed hall. At one end, Papa's sleeping alcove opened into a sitting room crammed with the Walker women's belongings, Alelia's first editions of Jean Toomer's Cane and Countess Cullen's Color, May's gold harp, and Madam's crystal Tiffany vases. At the other end, toward the rear of the apartment, 2 shadowy bedrooms, one of them May's, and a rarely used dining room led to a bright white-tiled kitchen where a dented porcelain pot always simmered with soup bones and stock, and where Papa held court at his knife-scarred oak table. While Papa and my mother talked, I escaped into May's room, drawn time and again by a moire silk vanity. Even now, I can feel a quiet enchantment as I recall grasping cool ivory mahjong tiles and miniature enameled King Tut mummy charms. I remember a fluffy ostrich fan in one drawer and mother of pearl opera glasses in another. The more I stirred May's belongings, the more the scent of her Shalimar dusting powder emerged, masking the familiar grandfather mustiness that clung to all the other rooms. Each piece of clothing, each photograph, each bejeweled mirror and monogrammed napkin became a genie's lamp waiting to be rubbed.
That's great.
Thank you.
I love that.
I had to put the book down and just take a moment. And I was like, oh, this isn't going to be like a typical history book. It's
Thank you.
biography.
Did you write that at the beginning or the end?
At the end,
Mm-hmm.
after I had done everything, then you sort of go back and kind of, meditate and like, what has this experience? What is it that I want? I want people to feel, my discovery process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So much about aroma.
Yeah, the smell is really, it just is the key, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I think so, especially when you're rummaging through your grandma's things.
Exactly.
It felt very familiar.
So we have one more comment from Cheryl saying she's enjoyed the presentation. And sorry to miss on Sunday, which is a nice segue to just sort of talking a little bit about Sunday. If you haven't signed up, you can go to southcoastalmanac.com/WBC, and we'll send you the info, where to meet up. And again, we're going to have the New Bedford Symphony, a trio of musicians from there who are going to play some songs, and we'll let you know, Alelia, what songs they've chosen. I don't know, and I'm so intrigued. And we'll be going around. We have some treats from the baker in downtown New Bedford, which is like the best baker, in all of the South Coast, but maybe Massachusetts, I think.
Wonderful.
And so we're excited about that. That's Sunday, 1 to 3. I know that after these events, we often send out a sort of a wrap up to folks if we had some things. And I know that Corey found a bunch of really great podcasts about Madam Walker, and we'll send those recommendations out to you. Also, just wanted to mention that Corey's leading some walking tours on Saturday, and I think they're for the Fabric Festival, Fall River Fabric Festival, and so there's still some.
The morning is sold out, but I think there's still some space in the afternoon at 3:00.
And you can find that also at southcoastspringarts.org. And I think that's all. But we are so grateful for your time, Aulilia. I can't wait for the next book. It seems like it's going to be fun. Like, I just think of it as, parties. I'm going to be reading about parties.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. And we will see you when you do your next book tour. Hopefully you'll be able to, if you come by,
be there in person.
Yes, that would be great. Okay.
All right.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.